They thought they had won. They were so sure of it, so certain that what they'd done had finished me. They were wrong. The first thing I felt was cold. Not the cold of a winter morning or an open window, but the cold of a room that doesn't know you, a place that keeps its distance. My eyes opened slowly, fighting the white glare of fluorescent lights overhead. My mouth was dry as chalk, and a low, steady beeping somewhere to my left filled the silence like a metronome, counting out the seconds of a life I wasn't sure I still wanted. I lay still for a moment, just breathing. Each breath came with a dull ache deep in my chest, like something inside had shifted and never quite settled back into place. The ceiling above me was flat and white, marked with a single water stain in the corner that looked almost like a hand reaching across the tile. I stared at it. I didn't know why. Then the memories came back. The kitchen floor, the way the room had tilted without warning, my hand grabbing for the counter and missing, the sound of the coffee mug shattering. Then nothing. A stroke, or something close to it, and I would learn later, enough to drop me where I stood. My fingers moved slowly across the stiff sheet beneath me. There was a tube in my arm, a thin, clear line running up to a bag hanging from a silver pole. My right hand felt heavier than usual, and when I tried to flex my fingers, they responded but sluggishly, like they were learning the motion for the first time. I noticed a small table beside the bed. On it sat my reading glasses, one arm slightly bent, and next to them, a worn leather bracelet, braided brown and tan. The kind you make at a summer camp, the kind a 7-year-old boy makes for his grandfather because he saw someone do it on television and wanted to try. My grandson had given it to me 6 years ago. I never took it off. I reached for it and held it in my palm. Where was my son? The door opened quietly, and a woman in scrubs stepped in. She had short gray hair and the kind of calm in her eyes that only comes from years of delivering news people don't want to hear. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you're awake. Good. What happened to me?" My voice came out rough, scraped hollow. "You had a transient ischemic attack. A TIA, we call it. A warning stroke." She checked the monitor beside me, making a small note on her tablet. "You were found by your neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. She heard the mud break and came to check on you. You were on the floor." I let that sit for a moment. Mrs. Peterson, 72 years old, lives alone next door, brings me tomatoes from her garden in August. She was the one who found me. "How long have I been here?" 2 days. She looked at me carefully. "We contacted your emergency contacts. Your son, your daughter-in-law." Something shifted in my chest, not the ache from the stroke. Something colder. "Did they come?" She didn't answer right away. She adjusted the IV line, smoothed the edge of the sheet, did the small things people do when they are trying to decide how much of the truth to give you. Then she looked at me directly, because she was the kind of woman who believed you deserved to be looked at when someone told you something hard. "Your son called back," she said. "He said he was traveling and couldn't get away. He said his wife would handle things." His wife. "She called the next morning. She asked about your condition and about your insurance coverage." A brief pause. "She did not ask when you'd be discharged or whether you'd need help at home." I turned my head toward the window. Outside, the sky was a pale gray, the kind of February sky that hasn't decided yet whether to snow. I could see the top of a bare oak tree, its branches splitting and splitting again into smaller lines against the white. 64 years ago, my father held me up at a window just like this one and pointed at a tree just like that one and said, "You see how the branches hold each other up? That's what family does." I had believed him my entire life. My son's name is David. He's 41. I raised him alone after his mother, Patricia, died of cancer when he was 11 years old. I worked 2 jobs for 3 years to keep the house, to keep his school the same, to keep as much of his world intact as I could while my own was falling apart. I coached his Little League team. I drove him to every college visit. I co-signed his first apartment lease, then his second when the first landlord kept the deposit for reasons neither of us understood. When he married Sandra, I paid for 1/3 of the wedding because her parents couldn't contribute much and I didn't want them to feel small. When they had my grandson Tyler, I drove 40 minutes each way twice a week to watch him so they could both work. I did all of this not because I was keeping score, but because that is what you do. That is what love looks like in practice, not in words. His wife had called to ask about my insurance. The gray-haired nurse, whose name tag read Ellen, touched my arm gently before she left. "Is there anyone else we should contact?" she asked. I thought about it. "There's a man named Walter Greer. He's in my phone under Walter. He's my attorney and my oldest friend." She nodded. "I'll have someone reach out." The door closed behind her and the room was quiet again. Just the beeping monitor and the pale winter light and the braided bracelet in my hand. My grandson had made it out of plastic lacing in yellow and blue, the colors of his favorite football team. He was 13 now, and I didn't see him nearly as much as I used to. Sandra had made that shift gradually, the way you change the temperature of water so slowly that what's in it doesn't notice until it's too late. I closed my eyes. I was not going to cry. Not here. Not for this. I was going to think. Walter arrived the next morning. He's 70 years old, the same age as me. With a white beard he's been growing since his retirement and the unhurried walk of a man who has made peace with time. He sat in the chair beside my bed, his coat still on, a paper cup of coffee from the hospital cafeteria in both hands, and he looked at me the way old friends do, like he was checking the structure of something he'd known for decades. "You look like you've been thinking too hard," he said. "I have." I told him everything, what Ellen had said, what David's wife had asked about. The 2 days I'd been here, with no visit, no voice I recognized, nothing but a neighbor's kindness standing between me and the floor. Walter listened without interrupting. He had always been good at that. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "David called me yesterday, not to ask about you. He asked whether a TIA qualified as a diminished capacity event under your estate documents." The words landed flat and heavy, like stones dropped into still water. "He wants to know if he can contest the will," Walter said, "or move on the power of attorney. He seems to believe this might be the opening he's been waiting for." I heard it all clearly. I understood what it meant, and a part of me that had been a father for 40 years felt something break cleanly in half, the way ice breaks all at once, no warning. "How long?" I said quietly. "Do you think this has been planned?" Walter set down his coffee. "Sandra's been asking questions through a mutual contact of ours for about 8 months. Small things. What assets are in your name? Whether the house is in a trust? Whether Tyler is named anywhere?" He looked at me steadily. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure. I'm telling you now because I am." I looked at the braided bracelet on the bedside table. Tyler had made it. But Tyler was 13 and lived inside a household that had been quietly calculating the value of my death for the better part of a year. My grandson was innocent in this. I had to be very careful not to forget that. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Walter reached into his coat and pulled out a small notepad. He had always worked from a notepad. Even when every other attorney in the city had moved to tablets and phones. He said paper made him think in straight lines. "First," he said, "we get your secondary power of attorney transferred away from David and over to me. You signed that option into the original documents 3 years ago. It's clean and it's legal, and it takes about 40 minutes to execute." He uncapped his pen. "Second, we look at the estate itself. What you want to do with it and how quickly you want to move." "I know what I want to do with it." He looked up. "I've been thinking about it since yesterday," I said. "Patricia's foundation." Walter was still for a moment, then something in his face settled, like a weight being placed exactly where it belonged. Patricia, my wife, had spent the last year of her life talking about a scholarship fund she wanted to start for kids in our district who aged out of foster care. She'd been a social worker for 22 years. She'd watched too many young people fall through the gap between the system and adult life. No family safety net, no cosigner, no one to call. She never got to build it. I had carried that intention for 30 years and never done anything with it. Until now. "I want to establish it properly," I said, "in her name. I want it funded from the estate. I want it to run after I'm gone." Walter wrote something down. "And David, my son will receive what the law requires and nothing more. Whatever discretionary assets I have, the house, the investment accounts, the business interests, They go to the foundation. Walter nodded slowly. I'll need a notary. I can have one here by this afternoon. Then let's do it this afternoon. He stood, buttoning his coat. For what it's worth, he said, Patricia would have done the same thing. I picked up the braided bracelet and turned it over in my hands. I know, I said. That's why I'm doing it. Walter came back at 2 o'clock with a notary and a folder of documents. The nurse, Ellen, stepped out to give us privacy. We worked for almost an hour, going through each section carefully, Walter explaining every clause in plain language the way he always had, treating me like a man in full possession of his mind, because that is exactly what I was. When we finished, I signed my name 11 times. My handwriting was steady. That evening, my phone lit up with a message from David. Not a call. A text. Dad, Sandra said she reached out to the hospital. Hope you're feeling better. Let us know if you need anything. I read it twice. I set the phone face down on the table beside the bracelet. The next morning, I was cleared for discharge. Ellen came in with the paperwork and the quiet efficiency of someone who has watched many people walk out of this room and knows the ones who leave stronger. She helped me with the discharge instructions, went over the medication list, and made sure I understood the follow-up appointments. Do you have someone to take you home? She asked. My neighbor, I said. Mrs. Peterson. She smiled. The one who found you. The same. Before I left, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the small drawer in the bedside table. Inside was a sheet of the hospital's plain white notepad paper, the kind with faint blue lines. I took it out and I wrote a letter. Not long, just 1 page. I didn't write it in anger. I wrote it in the same voice I used when I coached David's Little League team and had to sit a player down to tell him he wasn't starting. Steady and honest and without cruelty. I told my son what I had done and why. I told him that the house, the accounts, the things he had been quietly measuring for months were no longer coming to him. I told him that his mother had dreamed of something better and that I intended to build it in her memory. I told him that I forgave him because forgiveness is not something you give another person. It is something you give yourself, and I had lived long enough to understand the difference. I told him that if someday he wanted to meet for coffee and talk like 2 people who had once loved each other, I would be there for that conversation. But I would not be there for any other kind. I sealed it in an envelope and left it on the pillow. Then I put on my coat, picked up the small bag Ellen had helped me pack, and walked out of the room. The hallway smelled of floor cleaner and institutional coffee. My shoes made the same quiet sound on the tile that shoes always make in hospitals, a soft, measured sound that means someone is leaving. Mrs. Peterson was waiting by the exit in her green coat, her car keys already in her hand. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "You look like you slept." "A little," I said. "Good." She pushed open the door. "I made soup. Chicken and rice. It's in your kitchen already." I stopped walking for a moment. 60 years of building, working, giving, raising, and the person who had shown up when my life tipped sideways was the woman next door who grew tomatoes and knocked on my door because she heard something break. I had a foundation to build and a son to grieve and a whole second chapter to begin. But in that moment, all I felt was the cleanness of being known by someone who expected nothing. "Thank you, Margaret," I said. She waved her hand like it was nothing. "Come on, the soup's better hot." We drove through town in the early afternoon light, the streets of our small Georgia city moving past the windows in their ordinary way. I watched the storefronts and the traffic lights and the people going about their days, and I thought about Patricia and what she used to say every time a hard thing passed. She'd say, "Okay, what's next?" Not what happened, not how could they, not how do we survive it. Just okay, what's next? My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked at the screen. David. I let it ring. What he was about to find, whenever he went to that hospital room, was a letter. And what Sandra was about to find, whenever she called their attorney to ask about the estate, was that the answer had already changed. There was nothing malicious in any of it. There was no gloating, no performance. There was simply a decision, made clearly, made legally, made in the full strength of my own mind, and there was nothing either of them could do to reach back and undo it. The phone stopped buzzing. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. I turned it over in my lap and looked out the window instead. Walter called at 4 o'clock while I was sitting at my kitchen table eating Mrs. Peterson's soup, which was exactly as good as she'd promised. They reached the hospital, he said without preamble. David and Sandra both. They found the letter. I set down my spoon. And? Sandra called her attorney within the hour. He called me. A pause. There's nothing to challenge. The documents are clean. The transfer of the discretionary POA happened before any contested window. The foundation structure is airtight and you were clearly of sound mind and body throughout. Her attorney knows it. He told her as much. Another pause. David called her as much. Another pause. David called me after that. He cried. I was quiet for a moment. Did he ask about me? He asked if there was any way to reverse it. Walter's voice was careful. I told him no. He asked why you'd done it. I told him to read the letter again. I picked my spoon back up. All right, James. That was unusual. Walter almost never used my first name, even after all these years. Are you okay? I looked around the kitchen, the familiar counters, the window above the sink where the winter light came through clean and pale, the small cactus Patricia had bought at a farmer's market in 1991, and that I had kept alive through sheer stubbornness for 30 years. It was still there on the windowsill, compact and unhurried, asking nothing from anyone. I'm okay, I said. And I meant it in the way that you mean something, not because the pain is gone, but because you found the ground underneath it. 3 weeks later, Walter and I sat in a conference room at the law offices of a nonprofit attorney he trusted. On the table between us were the Articles of Incorporation for the Patricia Ann Holloway Scholarship Fund, a foundation to support young adults aging out of foster care in Fulton County, covering tuition, housing deposits, and first-year living expenses for recipients chosen each year by a committee of social workers, educators, and community members. I had named a woman named Dorothy Sims to the initial board. Dorothy had been one of Patricia's closest colleagues, a social worker for 35 years who had watched generations of kids walk out of the system with nothing. When I called to ask if she'd serve, she was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, Patricia tried to start this herself, you know, years ago. I know, I said. She told me. She would have loved this. I signed the incorporation documents on a Tuesday afternoon, outside the conference room window. Atlanta moved at its regular pace. Traffic and voices in the small ongoing business of a city that doesn't stop for anyone. I thought about Tyler, my grandson. I had called him separately, on his own phone, not through his parents. He was quiet when I explained the foundation. Quiet the way teenagers get when something is reaching them that they don't have words for yet. Grandpa, he said finally, are you and Dad okay? We're going to figure that out over time, I said. But you and I are okay. That's what I need you to know. Okay, he said, and then, quietly, I still have the one you gave me. The bracelet. I still wear it. I looked down at the braided plastic on my wrist. Yellow and blue, slightly faded now, the plastic worn smooth where it sat against my skin. So do I, Bud, I said. So do I. Walter was watching me when I set the phone down. He raised his coffee cup slightly. A small gesture, economical the way he was about everything. To Patricia, he said. He said. To Patricia, I said, and I drank. The foundation would open its first application cycle in September. We expected to award 4 scholarships in the first year and grow from there. Dorothy had already begun reaching out to her network. The first donor, after myself, was Mrs. Stair Peterson, who wrote a check for $500 and delivered it in a card that said, Your Patricia sounds like she was something? She was. She absolutely was. I drove home that evening as the sun went low over the city, painting the sky in the colors Patricia had loved, that particular deep orange that bleeds into rose before it darkens all the way down to blue. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove and watched the light and breathed. My phone had been quiet from David for over a week. I did not know if the silence meant anger or grief or something working its way slowly toward something better. I had meant what I said in the letter, that I would be there for the conversation if he ever wanted it. I still meant it. Some things take longer to grow than others. Some people need to lose something before they understand what they had. I had raised my son alone, and I had made mistakes, and so had he. And none of that erased the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during baseball games or the man who cried at his own wedding, openly without embarrassment, because he was happy and he didn't mind who saw. That man was still in there somewhere. I was willing to wait. But I was no longer willing to put my life on hold for the waiting. I had a foundation to build. A friend who made soup. A grandson who still wore a plastic bracelet. And the memory of a woman who had spent her whole life believing that every person who fell through the cracks deserved someone to reach back for them. I pulled into my driveway as the last light left the sky. I sat in the car for a moment, just sitting. Then I said out loud to no one and to Patricia and to the whole long life behind me that had led to exactly this point. Ooh. Oh, what's next? I got out of the car, walked up the porch steps, and opened the door.